The Mitchell mansion, usually a place of lively gatherings and prestigious events, stood eerily quiet that Saturday afternoon. The chandeliers glittered, reflecting against the polished marble floors, and the scent of freshly cut roses filled the air. A giant princess-themed cake, worth more than most people's monthly salary, sat untouched on a long table, surrounded by plates, party favors, and an array of perfectly wrapped gifts. And before we continue, let me ask you, where are you watching this story from? Drop your country or city in the comments, I'd love to know. Pink and gold balloons floated lazily toward the ceiling, entertainers stood ready in their bright costumes, and yet, not a single guest had arrived. At the center of it all sat little Emma, dressed in her favorite birthday gown, her wheelchair decorated with ribbons to make her feel like a princess. Her sparkling eyes, full of expectation, kept darting toward the grand double doors every few minutes, waiting for friends she was certain would come. Her father, Robert Mitchell, a man who had built empires, who had never known defeat in business, stood nearby, completely powerless in this moment, watching the minutes slip by with no laughter, no footsteps, and no cheerful voices to break the silence. Emma's voice, soft and innocent, broke the heavy silence as she asked for the fifth time, "Daddy, when will my friends get here?" Robert forced a smile, his throat tightening as he repeated another excuse about traffic, though both of them knew deep down that traffic wasn't the reason. Her accident, the tragic one that had stolen her ability to walk in her mother's life, had cast a shadow she didn't deserve. Once, her classmates had rushed to play with her, but now, many of them avoided her altogether, not out of pure cruelty, but because they didn't know how to treat her anymore. To children, her wheelchair had become a symbol of tragedy, something they didn't understand and therefore chose to ignore. Emma, however, didn't see herself as broken. She still carried the same joy, the same kindness, the same bright laughter. But on that day, as she sat in the middle of a grand party hall filled with decorations yet empty of guests, she was introduced to a cruel truth. Sometimes the world doesn't turn away because it hates you, but because it's easier not to face what you represent. And in that moment, Robert Mitchell, a man respected by millions, a man used to commanding power, found himself utterly powerless in the only place that mattered most, his daughter's happiness. Robert Mitchell had always been a man who believed that money could solve problems. When business competitors tried to crush him, he bought out their companies. When challenges rose in his empire, he hired the best minds to turn obstacles into opportunities. But standing in that silent hall, watching his daughter's hopeful eyes slowly dim with disappointment, he realized there were battles money could never win. His heart ached as he paced the floor, pretending to check his phone, making calls he knew were pointless, just so Emma wouldn't see the helplessness in his eyes. Every time she looked at him, he tried to smile, to reassure her that everything was fine, but deep down he felt the crushing weight of failure, not as a businessman, but as a father. The entertainers shifted awkwardly in the background, the towering cake seemed more like a cruel reminder of loneliness than a centerpiece of joy, and the balloons bobbed lifelessly in the still air. Robert thought about all the deals he had closed, all the luxuries he could afford, and yet none of it mattered in that moment. He couldn't buy Emma the laughter of true friends, he couldn't purchase the joy of a room filled with love, and he couldn't erase the shadow of her loneliness. What pierced his heart most was Emma's silence. She didn't cry, she didn't complain, she simply waited, believing that her friends would walk in at any moment. That innocent faith made his chest tighten because he knew that when the truth finally reached her, it would break her fragile heart in a way no father ever wanted to see. As the evening shadows lengthened across the marble floor, Robert's frustration quietly grew. He had excused himself from the party hall for a moment, more to hide his emotions than to take a break. Walking through the mansion's dimly lit corridors and down into the underground parking area, he searched for a moment of solitude where he could think. But what he stumbled upon there was not silence, it was a scene that struck him in a way no corporate meeting, no financial crisis, no market collapse ever had. There, tucked into a quiet corner beside a mop bucket and a battered cart filled with cleaning supplies, sat the young cleaner, a girl no older than her early 20s. She wore a faded blue uniform, her hair tied back neatly, and though exhaustion lingered in her posture, her eyes burned with determination. On the cold concrete floor, she had spread out a notebook, some worn textbooks, and a cheap pen that moved quickly across the page as she scribbled down calculations. She didn't notice him at first, she was too deeply immersed in her work, mouthing formulas under her breath as though the world outside had ceased to exist. Robert froze, his footsteps halting, his presence cloaked by the echoing hum of the overhead lights. For a man accustomed to commanding attention wherever he went, it was strange, almost humbling, to see someone so intent on their own path that his existence didn't matter. He studied her quietly, first with mild curiosity, then with disbelief. Why would a cleaner, someone who pushed mops and wiped floors for a living, spend her scarce free minutes buried in academic books? Her hands were rough from labor, her uniform smelled faintly of bleach, yet her concentration rivaled that of the most dedicated professionals he had ever seen in his high-rise offices. For a fleeting moment, he almost admired her, but the hardened shell of his pride quickly masked it. Instead of empathy, skepticism crept in. Surely, this was just an act, he thought. Perhaps she was only pretending to study to appear diligent, or maybe she was wasting her time chasing dreams too far beyond her reach. His lips curled into a smirk that he did not notice himself wearing, the kind of smirk that came from a man so used to measuring worth in numbers and status that he couldn't fathom ambition blooming in unlikely places. But as he turned to leave, he found himself glancing back one more time. The image of her hunched over those books, surrounded by symbols of labor and struggle, lodged itself into his mind like a thorn. He told himself it didn't matter, she was just a cleaner, and the worlds they lived in were galaxies apart. Yet beneath his dismissal, a strange unease lingered. He didn't know it then, but this quiet moment in the shadows of a parking garage would be the beginning of a story that neither of them could have ever imagined, a story that would shatter his arrogance, test his daughter's faith, and ultimately change the course of their lives forever. Robert returned to the party hall, but his mind was restless. The sight of that cleaner buried in her books clung to him, stirring questions he wasn't ready to face. As Emma's hopeful eyes searched once more toward the empty doorway, Robert felt something twist in his chest, the raw guilt of not being able to give her the one thing she wanted most, companionship.
His empire of wealth could provide anything material, yet it couldn't fill the void in her heart. And then, as though fate itself had drawn the lines of their story, the cleaner appeared in the background of the hall, quietly going about her duties. She moved with an elegance that seemed unusual for someone in her position, her every step careful, as though she carried not just cleaning tools but the burden of dreams too fragile to drop. Emma's gaze landed on her. In that moment, something shifted. The little girl, starved of attention and yearning for kindness, reached out with the simple purity that only a child can possess. "Hi," Emma called softly, her voice fragile but filled with warmth. The cleaner froze, her eyes darting toward Robert, unsure if she should respond. For workers like her, interacting with the master's family was a boundary rarely crossed. Yet Emma's smile, innocent, genuine, and unguarded, melted that hesitation. Slowly, almost shyly, the cleaner stepped closer, kneeling to Emma's level despite the disapproving glare Robert shot in her direction. What Robert saw in those fleeting seconds unsettled him. His daughter, who only moments ago sat cloaked in loneliness, now glowed with a spark of joy just from a stranger's presence. They began to talk in whispers, Emma asking questions about the balloons, her cake, even the glitter on her own dress, and the cleaner answering with gentle laughter that felt too natural, too sincere. To Robert, it was both comforting and infuriating. Comforting because Emma finally smiled, yet infuriating because it came from someone he deemed unworthy of belonging in their world. The divide between status and humanity had never felt sharper. Robert's pride burned, the idea that a stranger who scrubbed his floors could succeed where he had failed as a father was unbearable. But Emma didn't see uniforms or class divisions, she saw kindness. She didn't see a cleaner, she saw a friend. And in that instant, the walls of the mansion, with all their wealth and grandeur, seemed smaller, powerless compared to the invisible bond forming between two souls from entirely different worlds. It was the moment when privilege met perseverance, when innocence met sacrifice, and neither Robert nor the cleaner yet realized that this fragile connection, born in silence and defiance, would soon become the thread tying their fates together. The hall, once echoing with silence, now carried a new rhythm, the quiet giggles of Emma as she leaned closer to the cleaner, her loneliness momentarily forgotten. The girl, whose name Robert overheard as Amina, answered Emma's endless stream of questions with a patience that felt almost maternal. She showed Emma how to fold a napkin into a swan, let her touch the soft bristles of her cleaning brush, and even whispered a silly story about how one of the balloons had floated away earlier and joined the stars. To Emma, these tiny gestures were magic, they were the companionship she had been aching for all day. Robert, however, stood on the sidelines, torn between emotions he could hardly reconcile. His instinct screamed that this was wrong, his daughter shouldn't be reduced to finding joy in the company of a servant. And yet, the smile on Emma's face was undeniable, radiant in a way he hadn't seen since before the accident. Her laughter filled the cavernous room, bouncing off the marble pillars like music. For the first time that day, the emptiness didn't feel so heavy. But Robert's pride rebelled, his thoughts a storm of contradictions. Was this what his empire had come to, that the daughter of a millionaire found solace not among her peers, not among friends he could arrange with wealth or status, but in the presence of a cleaner? He clenched his fists as Amina knelt beside Emma's wheelchair, her gentle manner contrasting sharply against the polished perfection of the mansion. Robert noticed the faint calluses on her hands, the exhaustion hidden in her eyes, yet also the quiet dignity with which she carried herself. This wasn't just a girl doing her job, this was someone who refused to be crushed by circumstance. And that, in some buried place within him, unsettled him more than her presence itself. He felt threatened, not by her position, but by her resilience. It reminded him of something he had long forgotten, the raw hunger of ambition before he himself had built walls of arrogance around it. Emma, blissfully unaware of her father's inner turmoil, clapped her hands and tugged at Amina's sleeve. "Will you stay with me until my friends come?" she asked with hopeful eyes. Amina's lips parted, hesitation flashing across her face as she glanced nervously at Robert. She knew the rules of her world, the invisible line she was never meant to cross. And yet, faced with Emma's innocence, she found herself nodding. "For a little while," she whispered. Robert felt his jaw tighten, but when Emma's entire face lit up with joy, he couldn't bring himself to intervene. The contradiction tore at him, the more his pride resisted, the more his daughter's happiness urged him to relent. In that fragile triangle, a wealthy father, his lonely daughter, and a cleaner clutching at dreams too big for her world, something unspoken began to take shape. It wasn't friendship alone, nor rebellion, nor pity. It was the quiet start of a bond that defied class, status, and the boundaries that society had etched so deeply. Robert told himself it was temporary, insignificant, a moment that would pass. But in his heart, a seed of unease had already been planted. He didn't know it yet, but this small act of kindness, a cleaner kneeling beside his daughter, would ripple into choices, revelations, and consequences far greater than he could ever imagine. As the minutes stretched on, Robert found himself caught in a battle he hadn't prepared for, not with rivals, not with markets, but with himself. He stood stiffly near the grand cake table, his eyes fixed on Emma and Amina, their laughter rising like delicate threads stitching joy into the fabric of an evening that had nearly collapsed. Emma was radiant, her cheeks glowing with excitement as she begged Amina to show her more tricks with napkins, to tell her more stories. Amina obliged with quiet grace, always aware of Robert's gaze burning into her back, yet refusing to let the child down. For Robert, every giggle was a double-edged sword. On one side, relief, his daughter was smiling. On the other, humiliation, it wasn't him who made her smile, nor the lavish hall, nor the expensive entertainers. It was a cleaner, a girl with nothing but dreams and borrowed moments of courage. He cleared his throat, his deep voice echoing through the emptiness of the hall. "Emma," he said firmly, his tone carefully measured, "perhaps you should let this young lady return to her work." His words dripped with authority, the kind that made boardrooms fall silent. Emma, however, only tightened her grip on Amina's hand. "But Daddy," she pleaded softly, "she's my friend. She's the only one who came." The words struck him like a blade, piercing deeper than any insult he had ever endured in the world of business. The entertainers shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another, as if sensing the invisible storm brewing between father and daughter. Amina lowered her gaze, ready to retreat, but Emma's innocent defiance held her in place.
For the first time in years, Robert felt powerless. His empire couldn't command his daughter's heart. His wealth couldn't erase her loneliness. And his pride couldn't stop the truth echoing in her words. He saw himself reflected in Emma's fragile eyes, a man who had spent so long climbing towers of ambition that he had forgotten the ground where compassion lived. His instinct screamed to dismiss Amina, to restore the barrier between their worlds, but another part of him, a quieter, buried part, whispered that perhaps Emma saw something he had lost long ago. That whisper unsettled him more than Emma's plea. A tense silence fell, broken only by the flicker of candles atop the untouched cake. Robert's chest rose and fell, each breath heavier than the last, as he struggled between the man he had built and the father he longed to be. Emma, still clutching Amina's hand, looked at him with eyes shimmering with tears. "Please, Daddy, just this once." The plea was so soft, so fragile, that it shattered something inside him. His lips parted as if to argue, but no words came. For the first time, Robert Mitchell, the man who had never lost a negotiation, found himself conceding not to an opponent, but to his daughter's heart. And so, though his jaw tightened and his pride roared in protest, he gave the smallest of nods. Emma squealed with joy, hugging Amina tightly, while Robert turned away, hiding the storm raging inside him. He told himself it was only for tonight, only to spare his daughter's tears. But in truth, the cracks in his armor had already begun to form. What he didn't realize was that those cracks would only grow wider until they exposed parts of him he thought were long dead. The hall had shifted. It no longer felt like Robert's stage of wealth, but Emma's tiny kingdom where innocence reigned and barriers crumbled. Amina sat carefully on the edge of Emma's chair, her smile gentle as the little girl leaned against her shoulder, whispering secrets that only children trust to share. Robert, however, lingered near the tall windows, watching the two with a storm in his chest. The grand chandelier above glittered coldly, throwing light across a scene that unsettled him in ways he could not explain. He told himself it was only for tonight, only for Emma's fragile heart, yet deep down he sensed something irreversible had begun. The boundaries he had built, wealth above poverty, power above servitude, were being tested by something far stronger than status, compassion. Emma tugged at Amina's hand and laughed. "Will you come to my next birthday too?" Her voice rang with such unfiltered joy that it pierced Robert's chest like an accusation. He stepped forward, his voice deep and measured, struggling to reclaim control. "Emma, that is enough. She cannot stay here as if she belongs." His words cut sharply, the authority of a man used to obedience echoing against the marble walls. Amina's shoulders stiffened, and for a moment she looked as though she might retreat, but Emma's fingers tightened around hers. "But Daddy," Emma said with trembling defiance, her eyes wide and glistening, "she does belong. She's my friend, and she makes me happy." "Isn't that what matters?" The words stopped him cold. His empire, his reputation, his endless chase for perfection, all of it suddenly felt shallow against the truth spilling from his daughter's lips. Yet his pride clawed at him, demanding he restore the lines between their worlds. He turned to Amina, his gaze sharp. "What is your name?" he asked. She hesitated, lowering her eyes. "Amina, sir." The humility in her tone struck him with unexpected weight. "And what do you want from this?" Robert pressed, his voice like a challenge, as though daring her to reveal some hidden ambition. Amina's eyes lifted, steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Nothing, sir. I just didn't want her to feel alone." The simplicity of the answer unraveled him. No angle, no scheme, no hidden motive. Just kindness. He felt a lump rise in his throat, one he quickly swallowed, clenching his jaw to keep control. Emma looked from her father to Amina, sensing the invisible battle waging between pride and humility, power and compassion. For a brief, fragile moment, Robert saw his late wife's reflection in Emma, the same courage to speak truth, no matter how small the voice. He turned away, pretending to adjust his cufflinks, but his heart pounded with the weight of a war he was losing. The entertainers, still lingering awkwardly by the doorway, glanced at each other, sensing the tension yet daring not to move. The giant cake remained untouched, candles flickering lower, almost as if mocking the emptiness of wealth that could not fill a child's heart. Robert's empire stood tall outside those windows, the skyscrapers, the business deals, the billions, yet inside this hall, it all seemed fragile, threatened not by competitors but by the simple bond between a lonely child and a cleaner with quiet strength. Robert drew a sharp breath. He could feel the world he built pressing against him, demanding he reassert control, demanding he remind everyone of their place. But Emma's tiny hand still clung to Amina's, her defiance silent yet stronger than anything his money could buy. And in that defiance, Robert sensed the beginning of something dangerous, not for his wealth, but for the armor he had built around his heart. He realized, with a quiet dread, that his daughter's rebellion wasn't loud or reckless. It was silent, pure, and unstoppable. And it was breaking him. The air in the grand hall grew thicker, as though the walls themselves could feel the invisible clash between wealth and humanity, pride and love. Robert stood rigid near the towering columns, his hands clasped behind his back, his face carved into an expression of control. Yet inside, he was unraveling. Every time Emma laughed, every time she leaned against Amina's shoulder as if she had known her forever, Robert felt a sting that cut deeper than he dared admit. He had spared no expense on entertainers, decorations, and luxuries, yet none of it had filled the emptiness that a single moment of kindness from Amina now seemed to heal. His empire, his reputation, his authority, they all felt fragile against something so small, so human. And the more he resisted, the more he realized he was fighting not against Amina, but against himself. Emma's voice broke through the heavy silence. "Daddy," she said softly, almost cautiously, "why are you so upset? Don't you see? She's nice. She's the only one who stayed with me." The innocence in her tone was devastating, carrying no malice, only truth. Robert's jaw tightened as his gaze shifted to Amina, who still knelt beside Emma's chair, her hands folded nervously in her lap. Amina looked up at him with steady, unflinching eyes that carried exhaustion yet also quiet dignity. For the first time, Robert didn't just see a cleaner in a uniform, he saw a young woman with a story, a struggle, and dreams buried deep beneath calloused hands. That realization shook him. He wanted to dismiss it, to bury it under layers of authority, but the truth gnawed at him like a splinter.
"You don't understand, Emma," Robert said finally, his voice low but laced with strain. "There are lines in life. Lines we cannot cross. Not everyone belongs in our world." His words, though meant to sound firm, came out softer than he intended, almost as though he was trying to convince himself. Emma frowned, her small hands tightening around Amina's. "But Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling, "if our world makes people lonely, then maybe it's not a good world." The words hung in the air like a verdict, echoing louder than the ticking of the ornate clock above the fireplace. The entertainers froze, glancing at Robert with wide eyes, while Amina lowered her gaze to the polished floor, her heart thundering in her chest. Robert felt his throat tighten. His daughter's words had pierced through years of arrogance, striking at the very core of the man he had become. He thought of his own rise to power, of the countless sacrifices, the people he had stepped over, the nights he had convinced himself that wealth was worth the loneliness. And now, here was his daughter, fragile and innocent, holding hands with a cleaner and showing him what his billions could never buy. It was unbearable, and yet it was undeniable. He turned sharply toward the tall windows, his reflection staring back at him in the glass. For the first time in years, he didn't recognize the man he saw. Behind him, Emma giggled again as Amina folded another napkin into a swan, placing it gently in her lap. That small act of kindness, so pure, so uncalculated, struck Robert harder than any business defeat. He realized then that he was standing at the edge of something dangerous. If he allowed this bond to grow, if he allowed Emma to see the humanity in someone society deemed beneath them, then the walls he had built his entire empire upon would begin to crumble. And yet, to tear them apart now would shatter Emma's fragile happiness, leaving scars he could never heal. The battle inside him raged, a war between a father and a tycoon, between love and pride. The candles on the untouched cake flickered lower, casting long shadows across the hall, as though mocking the emptiness of his empire. The silence, broken only by Emma's soft laughter and the distant hum of the city outside, felt unbearable. Robert knew a choice was coming, one he could not delay forever. And for the first time in his life, he feared not the loss of power, not the threat of rivals, but the loss of his daughter's trust. The night pressed on, but the party had lost its shine. The laughter of guests faded, the entertainers lingered awkwardly, and the untouched cake became a cold monument to Robert's failure to give his daughter what she truly craved. The hall, once alive with opulence and noise, now felt like a stage where a far greater drama was unfolding, one that had nothing to do with wealth, but everything to do with love, loneliness, and pride. Robert stood stiffly near the fireplace, his shadow stretching long against the marble floor. He could feel his empire trembling, not from financial ruin, but from the innocent defiance of a little girl and the quiet courage of a woman society told him should remain invisible. Emma's voice carried across the heavy silence, fragile but insistent. "Daddy, please don't be mad at her. She didn't do anything wrong. She's the only one who listened to me tonight." Her eyes glistened, her small hands clutching Amina's arm as though holding onto something she couldn't bear to lose. Robert's chest tightened. He wanted to command, to demand obedience, to tell Emma she didn't understand the world, but for the first time, he wasn't sure he believed his own arguments anymore. His wealth had built walls around him, but those same walls had left his daughter lonely in a room full of people. He turned sharply toward Amina, his gaze like steel. "You," he said, his voice cold enough to slice through the air. "Why are you here? Why couldn't you just stay in your place?" His words carried not only anger but fear of what her presence stirred inside him. Amina flinched, but she didn't lower her head this time. Instead, she met his eyes with a quiet strength that unsettled him. "Because she needed someone, sir," she said simply, her voice soft but steady. "And I couldn't walk away." The words were not bold, not rebellious, but they struck Robert harder than a shout would have. There was no calculation in her tone, no attempt to win favor. Just truth. Emma tugged on Robert's sleeve, her little voice breaking as tears welled in her eyes. "Daddy, why do you always push people away? I just wanted a friend. Don't you want me to be happy?" The question pierced him, shattering the walls of control he had fought so hard to maintain. For a moment, the tycoon who commanded boardrooms and silenced rivals stood stripped bare, just a father facing the raw pain in his daughter's eyes. His lips parted, but no words came. He looked at Emma, her innocence, her hope, and then at Amina, whose presence seemed to challenge everything he thought he knew about worth and belonging. The silence grew unbearable. Even the flicker of the chandeliers above seemed to mock him, reflecting the emptiness of a celebration without joy. Robert's pride screamed for him to end it now, to order Amina out and restore the lines of power. But another voice, quieter, buried deep, whispered that if he did, he would lose more than a worker. He would lose his daughter's trust, her love, perhaps even her respect. And that was a loss no fortune could repair. Robert's fists clenched at his sides as his mind spiraled. He thought of his late wife, the only person who had ever dared to look past his pride and see the man beneath. He remembered her words, once spoken in this very hall, "Wealth means nothing if it can't make a child smile." And now, years later, he stood watching another woman, this time a cleaner, not a queen of high society, accomplish what he had failed to do. He turned toward the windows, staring out at the sprawling city he had conquered. The skyscrapers glittered like stars, monuments to his ambition. Yet inside, his daughter sat smiling with a woman who had nothing but her kindness, and it terrified him more than any competitor ever could. For the first time in his life, Robert felt powerless. The empire he had spent decades building was not crumbling from the outside, it was cracking from within, threatened by something he could neither control nor destroy. And deep in his chest, he knew, this was only the beginning. The bond between Emma and Amina was no longer a passing moment. It was growing roots that could one day pull down the very walls he had built to protect his pride. And Robert, though he hated to admit it, feared that when the time came, he would be powerless to stop it. The hall seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for Robert to make his move. Outside the tall windows, the city pulsed with life, 1,000 lights burning in the distance, yet inside, the Mitchell mansion felt like the center of a storm. Emma sat close to Amina, her tiny fingers gripping the cleaner's hand as though she had found an anchor she could not release. Amina's uniform was simple, her hands slightly trembling, but her presence radiated something no jewel, no entertainer, no expensive gift could rival: sincerity. And Robert hated that he could see it. Hated that it was undeniable.
He took a step forward, his polished shoes echoing on the marble, his jaw set so tightly it seemed carved from stone. "Emma," he said, his voice low, controlled, yet carrying a sharp edge, "you don't understand what you're asking of me. You don't see the consequences." His daughter looked up at him, her big eyes glistening, her voice trembling but firm. "The only consequence, Daddy, is that I'm happy when she's here. Isn't that enough?" The words were like a dagger, simple, innocent, yet they cut deeper than any accusation. Robert's chest heaved as he turned his gaze toward Amina. "And you," he said sharply, his voice reverberating through the grand hall, "what do you think you're doing? You're here to work, not to meddle in matters you can't begin to understand. Do you realize what people would say if they saw this?" His words were meant to put her in her place, to remind her of the invisible lines society had drawn. But Amina, though her hands trembled, did not bow her head. Her voice came out steady, carrying a quiet courage. "With respect, sir," she replied, "I don't care what people would say. I only saw a little girl who didn't deserve to feel abandoned on her birthday. That's all that matters to me." Her honesty hung in the air like a blade. Emma squeezed Amina's hand tighter, nodding eagerly, her tears forgotten for a moment. "See, Daddy? She understands me. She didn't leave. She didn't laugh. She stayed." Those simple words broke something in Robert. His empire, his pride, his carefully constructed world, all of it felt suddenly hollow, like an empty palace built on sand. He thought of all the birthdays he had missed, all the promises he had replaced with gifts instead of presents, all the moments when his wealth had spoken louder than his heart. And now, here was a stranger, a cleaner, doing what he, with all his billions, had failed to do: give his daughter joy. The silence grew unbearable. Even the candles flickered as if mocking his helplessness. The entertainers had vanished quietly, sensing the tension. The grand cake sat untouched, its frosting beginning to crack, a perfect symbol of everything Robert had built, beautiful on the outside, hollow on the inside. His fists clenched, his throat tightened, but his mask of control was slipping fast. Emma's small voice pierced the silence once more. "Daddy, if you make her go, I'll never forgive you." The words were soft, not shouted, but they landed like thunder in Robert's chest. His breath caught, his vision blurred for a moment as the weight of her ultimatum sank in. Never forgive him. He could survive the loss of money, of status, even of empire, but the thought of losing his daughter's love was unbearable. For the first time, fear gripped him in a way no business rival had ever managed. He staggered slightly, his hand bracing against the edge of the grand table. His reflection in the polished surface looked like a stranger, a man trapped by his own walls, fighting a battle he could not win. And in that moment, Robert realized the truth: the more he fought against Emma's bond with Amina, the more he would lose her. His empire was strong, but his daughter's heart was fragile, and he was about to crush it with his own pride. The storm inside him raged: pride versus love, authority versus compassion, empire versus family. The marble walls seemed to close in, the silence pressing on him until it was almost suffocating. For decades, Robert Mitchell had lived as a man who could not be bent, who would never bow. Yet tonight, in his own home, faced not with rivals or kings but with a child and a cleaner, he felt his empire tremble like a house of cards. And though he said nothing yet, though his lips pressed shut in silence, a single truth gnawed at him: change was coming. He could resist it, deny it, fight it with everything he had, but the cracks were there. And once cracks appear in an empire, it is only a matter of time before the walls collapse.